The sun blazed down mercilessly, its heat unrelenting, and for 3 long weeks a German shepherd had been left alone to suffer in the sweltering heat. No food, no water, nothing but the endless sky above and the unforgiving earth below. The dog was weak, its ribs poking out from beneath its thin coat, its fur matted with dirt and sweat. But then, just when hope seemed to vanish, something extraordinary happened. A local rescuer, Sarah, found the dog, offered it food and water, and expected the usual reaction. Relief, maybe even a wag of the tail. But instead, the dog howled. Not a simple cry of hunger or thirst, but something deeper, more desperate. It was a howl full of pain, yes, but also urgency. A call for help that carried a weight Sarah couldn't ignore. But what was it trying to say? And why couldn't it stop howling? Stay with us. What happens next will shock you. Sarah had spent years working as an animal rescuer, wandering through the streets of the small town, looking for neglected and abandoned animals. She was used to the sight of strays, some broken by the harshness of life, others just lost, but none of them had affected her like this one. It was early afternoon when she first heard it. The howling. It echoed in the quiet streets, almost haunting, as if it was calling out to her. At first, she thought it was just another stray dog, abandoned and hungry. But something about the sound felt different. The cry wasn't just an expression of discomfort, it was urgent, filled with a kind of desperation that made Sarah's heart race. She followed the sound, her footsteps quickening as she moved closer. The dog was collapsed on the ground in an alleyway, its body limp and exhausted. As Sarah knelt down beside the animal, she noticed just how badly it had been neglected. The German shepherd's once beautiful coat was now matted with dirt, and its eyes were sunken and hollow from dehydration. Its ribs jutted out from its sides as though there was nothing left of the dog but skin and bones. "Hey there, boy," Sarah whispered, her voice gentle but full of concern. The dog lifted its head slowly, looking up at her with dull, tired eyes. It had no strength left to stand, no energy left to wag its tail. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a bottle of water, uncapping it with shaking hands. She poured some into her palm and offered it to the dog, but it didn't drink right away. Instead, it looked at her, and for a brief moment, Sarah swore she saw something in its eyes, a plea, an urgency, as if it was trying to communicate something that she couldn't quite grasp. Then, finally, it lapped up the water gratefully, as though it had been parched for days. Sarah watched, relieved that at least the dog had something to drink, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The dog's body, though weakened, seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. She gently set the water bottle aside and reached for a packet of food. Her hands trembled slightly as she tore it open and offered it to the dog. The moment it sniffed the food, it hesitated, then began eating furiously, as if it hadn't eaten in days. But it wasn't just hunger that drove the dog. It was desperation, the kind of desperation that made Sarah's stomach twist. And then, just as she thought the worst was over, the dog let out another howl. This time, louder. A cry so intense that it felt like the air around them shivered. It was like the dog was trying to say something, but Sarah couldn't understand it. She hadn't been a rescuer for so long not to recognize suffering. But this, it was different. It wasn't the typical sound of a dog in distress from neglect or injury. This was something deeper, something that called out to her in a way she couldn't ignore. Sarah crouched down beside the dog, stroking its back, trying to calm it. But the howls didn't stop. They grew louder, more desperate, like a plea that couldn't be answered. The dog's body trembled as it cried out, its tail flicking nervously. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure it was. "I'm here. You're safe now." But even as Sarah reassured the dog, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about food or water. Something more was at play here, something more than simple hunger or thirst. The howls continued, pulling Sarah in. Each cry felt like a piece of a puzzle that she couldn't yet see, but that was somehow leading her down a path she had no idea was waiting. Sarah couldn't help but wonder what this dog had been through, why it had been left alone for so long, and why it was calling out now, as if it was trying to communicate something beyond the simple need for food or comfort. There was something more to this dog's story, something hidden beneath the surface that only time would reveal. As Sarah sat beside the dog, listening to its cries, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just another rescue. This was the beginning of something far bigger, something she couldn't yet understand. And whatever it was, it had already started. She had no idea that she was about to uncover a truth that would change everything, about the dog, about herself, and about the lives of others. The dog's howl wasn't just an expression of pain. It was a call for help, a call that would lead her to a discovery she could never have imagined. The German shepherd had stopped eating. Sarah, having assumed that the dog was simply starving and exhausted, didn't expect this sudden pause. It hadn't been long since it had devoured the food she offered, yet now its eyes had taken on a distant, almost sorrowful look. It stared at her, its head tilted slightly, as if it were trying to communicate. And then, once more, it howled. This time it was different. There was no pain in the howl, no weakness. This was something more deliberate. Something deep within the dog was trying to break through. The dog's body trembled, and its howls echoed off the walls of the empty alleyway, unsettling the stillness of the air around them. Sarah's heart beat faster. She had dealt with many animals in distress, but nothing had prepared her for this. What was the dog trying to say? She gently placed a hand on its fur, her fingers brushing against the thin coat. "Shh, it's okay," she murmured, trying to calm it down, but the dog's focus never shifted from her. It seemed as if it was waiting for something, or someone. Sarah's mind raced. She had seen animals in pain, animals who were lost or abandoned, but this was different. There was a sense of purpose behind the dog's behavior, something that was beyond its immediate suffering. The dog's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something, a glimmer of understanding. But it was gone before she could make sense of it. The dog let out another howl, but this time it didn't stop. It continued, long and mournful, as if it were calling out to someone. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had seen strays that howled in hunger, and she had seen dogs cry out from pain, but this was different. This was a sound that held more, something unspoken. And yet there was an urgency behind it that couldn't be ignored. The dog was trying to tell her something. It wasn't just a cry for help, it was a cry that was begging to be heard, something it couldn't express through mere hunger. She couldn't understand why, but the howl struck her as a call for something else. There was a pleading in the dog's voice, a raw need that surpassed the animal's physical discomfort. It was as though it was asking for something beyond just being fed. Was it asking for safety, for rescue, for something far more important? Whatever it was, Sarah couldn't ignore it. She had been trained to rescue animals, but she had never been confronted with something like this. The dog's howling began to subside after a few minutes, but its body was still tense, its chest heaving with each shallow breath. It was exhausted, and yet it wouldn't rest. There was something about its presence that seemed to demand action, a pull that Sarah couldn't resist. It had been through so much, physically emaciated and vulnerable, but still it had strength. Strength that seemed to be urging Sarah to do more than just provide food and water. As Sarah knelt beside the dog, she noticed a faint scar on its side, barely visible beneath the dirt and matted fur. A mark of a past injury. Another reminder of the dog's hardships. The marks on its body told the story of neglect, of a life lived in isolation, without care. The kind of suffering that left scars not just on the body, but deep within the soul. Sarah felt her heart ache as she gently stroked the dog's side, careful not to hurt it further. She had seen abandonment before, but this felt different. She couldn't just take the dog to a shelter and forget about it like the others. There was more to this dog's story, more than anyone could have imagined. And the howls, the endless, mournful howls, spoke of something deeper, something Sarah had yet to understand. She knew she had to do something. But what? The dog was clearly in need of care, but it was asking for more than just that. The intense howling, the way it seemed to look at her with a kind of silent understanding, made it clear that the dog wasn't just in need of a home. No, this was more than that. It was as if the dog had been sent to her, as if it knew something she didn't. Sarah stood up, pacing back and forth. She felt helpless. How could she help? The dog had been abandoned for far too long, and she could see the toll it had taken on it. But the more she looked at it, the more she felt like it was asking her to go further, to uncover a truth that had been hidden beneath the surface. She leaned down again, her hand brushing against the dog's fur, and she whispered, "What is it? What do you want me to do?" The dog's eyes seemed to lock onto hers as if urging her to listen, to understand. Suddenly, the dog shifted and slowly began to get up. Its body wobbled, its legs trembling from exhaustion, but it stood firm. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched the dog carefully step toward the alley's end. It didn't walk like a normal animal that had been freed from hunger. It moved with purpose. Sarah couldn't explain why, but something inside her urged her to follow. The dog was no longer simply an animal in need. It was a creature with a mission, a purpose that was beginning to unfold. With a glance back at Sarah, the dog took a few more steps forward, its eyes never leaving hers. Its movements were slow but determined, almost as though it had waited for Sarah to catch up. Sarah, feeling a pull she couldn't resist, stood up and followed. She didn't know where this path would lead her, but somehow, deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. The howls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just begun to uncover what the dog was trying to say. There was more to this animal than anyone had realized, and if Sarah followed it, she would soon learn just how far this journey would take her. Sarah followed the dog through the narrow, dimly lit alley, unsure of what to expect. The German Shepherd had slowly led her from the alley, its gait steady despite its earlier exhaustion. With each step, Sarah felt a growing sense of urgency in the air around them. The dog didn't look back at her, but its eyes flicked to the path ahead as though it knew exactly where it was going. The sun was low now, casting long shadows over the quiet street, and the usual hum of the town had quieted. Sarah tried to process everything that had happened. She had seen her share of stray animals, most of them simply lost or abandoned, wandering through the streets, hungry and alone. But this dog was different. There was something deliberate in its actions, something more than just the instinct for survival. The howl, it echoed in her mind, a sound that seemed to say more than just, "Help me." It was as if the dog was speaking to her in a language that transcended words, telling her it was guarding something, or someone. She quickened her pace, her breath catching in her throat. The dog led her down streets she barely recognized. They were moving deeper into the outskirts of the town, past familiar storefronts and through winding alleys that Sarah had never explored before. The neighborhood was older here, the buildings aging and abandoned, the paint peeling off the walls, windows boarded up. The area seemed forgotten by time. It was the kind of place where no one ventured, where the shadows felt just a little too long, and the air was thick with secrets. Despite the eerie silence, the dog moved with confidence. It took turns without hesitation, as if it knew exactly where it was headed, and Sarah, though confused and uneasy, kept following. Every instinct told her to turn back, to call for help, to leave this strange journey behind. But something in her gut told her that she was meant to be here, that this was important. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an inexplicable pull. The howls had stopped, replaced by an almost unnerving calm. The dog halted at a rusted gate that led into a small, overgrown yard, surrounded by a fence that had clearly seen better days. The dog stood still, as if waiting for Sarah to catch up. She approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The yard was untended, overrun with weeds and ivy creeping up the sides of the dilapidated house beyond. It looked abandoned, much like everything else in this forgotten part of the town. "What is this place?" Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the dog. The German shepherd turned its head toward her and gave one last soft, pleading whine before it stepped forward and nudged the gate with its nose. Sarah hesitated. It wasn't safe to just go walking into unknown properties, especially ones that seemed long forgotten by the rest of the world. But the dog was insistent, nudging the gate again, its eyes locked onto hers as though saying, "This is where we need to go." With a deep breath, Sarah reached out and gently pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly, breaking the silence, and the air seemed to grow even heavier. The dog led her toward the house, pausing only briefly at the front door. Sarah followed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of something much bigger than herself. As Sarah approached the front door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the old weathered knob, she felt the weight of the dog's gaze on her. It was standing just behind her now, watching with that same unwavering intensity. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. Dust hung in the air, thick with the scent of mold and age. The light from outside barely pierced through the grime on the windows, casting long shadows across the room. It was empty. At least that's what Sarah assumed at first. The place felt abandoned, with overturned furniture and broken windows. But as she stepped further in, she noticed something strange. There were signs of life here, but not the kind she expected. The walls were covered with drawings, hastily scribbled images of animals, strange symbols, and people. Sarah's eyes lingered on the drawings, a strange unease settling in her stomach. Some of the images were unsettling, chaotic, almost frantic. She could tell that the person who had drawn them was in distress. But what was even more disturbing was the presence of these drawings in a place like this, abandoned, isolated, seemingly forgotten by the rest of the world. The dog moved past her and into the room, its nose twitching. It was calm now, but Sarah could see that it was alert, like it was searching for something. She followed, her feet dragging on the creaky wooden floorboards. The atmosphere in the house seemed to weigh on her. It was as though the walls themselves were holding secrets, waiting to be uncovered. Suddenly, as Sarah stepped closer to the center of the room, she felt something shift in the air, a subtle change, but one she couldn't ignore. The dog's posture became tense, and it immediately began to move again, sniffing the floor and then the walls. Sarah watched in silence, her curiosity piqued, but she had no idea what was going on. The dog stopped at a corner of the room, where the floor was cracked. It barked once, sharply, before nudging the floorboard with its nose. Sarah knelt down, pushing her fingers against the crack. Her heart skipped a beat when the floorboard shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Her mind raced as she opened it carefully. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the first few pages. The handwriting was messy, erratic, almost as if the person who had written it was in a hurry or distress. The more she read, the clearer it became. The journal belonged to someone who had been living here, someone who had been documenting something strange. The dog's persistent nudging brought Sarah back to the present. It was staring at the journal, and then, as if guided by instinct, it padded over to a small pile of papers in the corner of the room, half buried beneath old newspapers and dust. Sarah hesitated, then moved toward it, her heart pounding as she wondered if there was more to the story. What she found next would change everything. Sarah's hands shook as she held the journal. feeling a sense of dread creeping into her chest. The room felt colder now, as though the air itself had thickened, weighed down by the discovery she was about to make. The dog had stopped moving, now sitting quietly at her feet, its eyes fixed on the journal with an intensity that felt almost knowing, as if it were waiting for Sarah to realize something. She flipped through the pages of the leather-bound book, her mind racing. The handwriting was erratic, the ink smudged in places as though it had been written in haste, but the words were clear enough. They found me. They know who I am. The dog is the key. It knows. The sentences sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The journal seemed to belong to someone who had been living here in this house, someone hiding from something. It was clear now that this wasn't just a random abandoned home. Someone had been here recently. Someone who had been protecting something. Someone who had been watching, waiting for the right time. But what did it all mean? And how was the dog involved in this strange, almost supernatural situation? Sarah continued reading, her heart pounding harder with each page. The entries became more frantic as the author described a growing sense of paranoia and fear. The dog, her dog, the one in front of her, had been by this person's side the whole time, watching over them, guarding them against something that had been hunting them. The dog knows what they want. The dog knows what they're looking for. And then, the final entry stopped her in her tracks. I'm afraid I won't make it. But the dog... The last sentence was illegible, smeared with what appeared to be tears or rain. But Sarah could make out enough to understand. The dog was not just a pet. It wasn't just a guardian. The dog was involved in something far bigger than either of them. The dog's howl had started again, soft at first, but then it grew louder, more insistent. Sarah felt her heart race as the room seemed to shift around her. The atmosphere was changing, as though something, or someone, was watching them from the shadows. The dog stood suddenly, its body tense, and began to move toward the back of the room. It didn't bark or whine. Its movements were deliberate, and Sarah knew it was time to follow. She stood up, her legs shaky, still clutching the journal in one hand. She felt the weight of the moment. The dog was leading her to something she had to see for herself. The room felt alive now, like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the silence, every rustle of the wind outside. As Sarah moved toward the back of the house, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her senses on high alert. The dog led her to a hidden door, tucked behind a bookshelf in the far corner. She hadn't noticed it before. It blended so seamlessly with the walls. The dog gave her a pointed look, its eyes glowing with a strange intensity. Sarah placed her hand on the door, feeling a coldness seep through the wood. She hesitated, looking back at the dog. This was it. Whatever truth had been hidden in this house, the dog knew it. The key was the dog, just as the journal had said. She turned the knob slowly and pushed the door open. The hinges squeaked and the air inside felt even colder. It was a small room, almost entirely empty except for a table and a chair. On the table was an old, dusty box, wooden with intricate carvings on its surface. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had seen this box before. Its shape was unmistakable. The same box the journal had described. The dog entered the room ahead of her, moving confidently toward the table. It nudged the box with its nose, and Sarah could feel the pull to investigate, to understand what lay inside. Her heart was pounding in her ears as she slowly stepped forward, lifting the box and placing it on the table. The dog sat down at her feet, staring at the box expectantly. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect, but she knew, deep down, that whatever was inside would be the key to everything. The dog's past, the journal, the howls, and the strange urgency it had shown. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid of the box, her eyes widening at the sight of what lay inside. It wasn't much, a few old papers, an envelope sealed with wax, and what looked like a strange, ancient key. The papers inside were yellowed with age, the edges curled from years of neglect. As Sarah reached for the papers, the dog let out a quiet, almost reverent whine. She felt it. This was it. She wasn't just discovering the past. She was unearthing something far more significant. She was unlocking something that had been hidden for years. The first paper she picked up was a letter, written in the same hasty, paranoid handwriting as the journal. The words were filled with urgency. If you are reading this, you have found what was never meant to be found. The dog is not just a protector. It is the key. It holds the secret of what happened to me, to us. The time has come for the truth to be revealed. The dog has kept this secret for too long. The key will unlock what they've been looking for, what they've been trying to destroy. It's up to you now to finish what I started. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The dog, the German Shepherd, wasn't just a companion. It had been hiding something for years, something it had been guarding with its life. But what was it? And why had it been kept secret for so long? She glanced down at the key, feeling its weight in her hand. This was the moment that would change everything. The key had been hidden away for a reason. She had no idea what doors it would open, but she knew she had to take the next step. The dog had brought her here for a reason. The room felt like it was closing in around her as she looked back at the dog. Its eyes met hers, full of wisdom, full of a history that was far beyond anything Sarah had ever imagined. It wasn't just a guardian. It was a part of something much larger, something that spanned years, perhaps centuries. But the dog wasn't done yet. There was one more piece of the puzzle left to uncover. The howls had been a call for help. They had led Sarah here, to this very moment. Now the question was, what would she do next? With the key in her hand, Sarah took a deep breath. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew this was just the beginning. The mystery was unfolding before her eyes, and with the dog by her side, she was ready to uncover the truth. The wind had picked up, the soft breeze carrying the promise of change as Sarah stood outside the run-down shack, her heart still racing from the shock of what she had just discovered. The German Shepherd, now resting comfortably beside her, had become more than just a rescue. It had become a hero. She glanced down at the dog, whose once hollow eyes now gleamed with gratitude. No longer was it a victim of neglect and abandonment. The brave German Shepherd had done something no one could have imagined. It had protected 3 children, giving them the strength to survive the unforgiving conditions of the world outside. After hours of securing the children, offering them water and warmth, Sarah had called for help. Soon, the authorities arrived to take the children into their care. The sight of the young ones, frightened but now safe, was enough to bring tears to Sarah's eyes. They clung to each other, their faces stained with dirt, but their eyes shone with a glimmer of hope. As for the dog, it had been a silent protector, watching over them from the shadows. Its howls had not been cries for help, but warnings for something far greater than itself. It had waited until Sarah arrived, making sure the children were safe before letting out that final, desperate howl. The dog had understood something that no one else had. It had never been about survival alone. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. As the authorities took the children into the care of social workers, Sarah stood beside the German Shepherd, running her hand gently through its matted fur. The dog was exhausted, but there was a sense of peace in its demeanor now. It had fulfilled its mission, had kept the children alive, and now it was ready to rest. But the story didn't end there. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved them." For the first time in what seemed like forever, the dog relaxed. Its body, once tense and guarded, seemed to let go of the weight it had been carrying for so long. It wasn't just a survivor, it was a guardian, a true hero whose sacrifice had ensured that the children would live to see another day. It was a hero, not in the conventional sense, but in the truest form of the word. No accolades, no medals. Just a quiet act of courage that had changed lives forever. The children were safely transferred to the local shelter, where they would be given the care and support they needed to recover from their traumatic ordeal. Sarah had stayed with them for hours, making sure they were settled and comfortable before returning to the German Shepherd. The dog had stayed by her side, its eyes never leaving the children, as if it still couldn't believe its mission had been completed. That night, as Sarah sat with the dog in the shelter's small room, she reflected on everything that had transpired. The road to this moment had been long and filled with uncertainty. She had been on countless rescue missions before, but none had ever touched her heart like this one. The bond between the dog and the children was undeniable. It wasn't just the dog's instinct to protect. It was something deeper, something much stronger than anyone could have anticipated. The German Shepherd had not just been fighting to survive. It had been fighting for those it loved, even when it had nothing left to give. It had sacrificed its safety, its comfort, its very survival to ensure the well-being of others. And in that sacrifice, it had become the hero of the story. It was the kind of hero that the world often overlooked, the quiet, unseen, and selfless one who would do anything for those they cared about. The following days were filled with phone calls, paperwork, and the hum of daily life, but Sarah couldn't shake the image of the German Shepherd and the children from her mind. She kept visiting the shelter, checking on the dog, offering love and care. It wasn't long before the shelter director reached out to Sarah, letting her know that the dog was ready for adoption. It seemed only right that the dog would find a home, but there was one thing Sarah knew in her heart. This dog had been through too much, had sacrificed too much to be left to live out its days in a kennel. Sarah couldn't let it go. She had already lost count of the number of rescues she had done, but this was different. The German Shepherd wasn't just a victim, it was her partner, her hero. 1 week later, Sarah officially adopted the dog. It had found its place in her home, where it was given all the love and attention it deserved. But she never forgot the lesson it had taught her, the lesson that sometimes heroes come in the most unexpected forms. They're not always the ones who wear capes or get recognized on the front page of the news. Sometimes heroes are the silent protectors, the ones who stand guard when no one else will. As Sarah watched the German Shepherd rest on the couch beside her, she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. It had been through so much, and yet it had never given up. It had saved lives, without asking for anything in return. The dog had been the unsung hero in a world full of noise, and Sarah would never forget that. In the days that followed, Sarah shared the story of the German Shepherd with everyone she met. It wasn't just a rescue story. It was a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting those who can't protect themselves. And sometimes, the greatest acts of heroism are the ones done in silence. The German Shepherd had taught her that the heart of a hero doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in whispers, in howls that call out for help, and in quiet acts of courage that change the world in ways no one expects. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You won't believe what happens next in our next video. Tjusk,